representatives on that steering committee, along with Commissioner Anders. Is that correct? Yes. So thank you for joining us. As I mentioned, we have information items today, and the first one is a presentation by a faculty member from UNCW, Dr. Jarvis. Welcome, Dr. Jarvis. I'll just say briefly, come on forward if you like. She's going to be speaking on submerged aquatic vegetation and water clarity. She's associate professor at UNC Wilmington and a member of the Scientific Advisory Council, which is involved in the nutrient criteria development program planning effort with the state for SAV. Commissioner Harris and I heard her speak in October at a meeting in New Bern, and she kindly agreed to come and present to us today. So you have a presentation package in your materials, and then I've also handed out, if I've missed anyone, let me know, copies of one particular article, Dr. Jarvis, that you cited in your presentation on SAV light needs. And so I've just prepared a handout for folks so they can take it home with them and read at their leisure.
Nice. I do the same for my students, so that's great.
But thank you for coming. After we hear from you, we'll be hearing from Karen Hickens in the Division of Water Resources, updating us on the process that's going on right now with SAC.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for having me today. I love talking about SAV, so any chance I get to talk about it with folks who are interested, it kind of makes my day, so I'm excited to be here. I know Dr. Kenworthy gave a talk a few months ago, I think, to this board about SAV and why they're important, what they do, so I will skip over that part of the presentation and kind of talk about why we are so interested with water clarity in SAV. In particular, why we want to set a clarity standard. And so before we can even begin to set a clarity standard for the state, we had to think about two important things. The first being, what is the minimal amount of light that SAV needs to survive? And we figure we can calculate that based on the maximum depth at which they grow. So if we can know how deep they grow, we're going to assume they grow into the point where they don't get enough light to actually survive. So if we know that depth limit, and then we know how much light is actually available at that depth, we can determine from that their minimum light requirement. And so we have to know the light attenuation coefficient, or how quickly light is lost as you increase depth. Because, 2 meters in our beautiful core sound is very different light availability than 2 meters in the mouth of the Cape Fear River, right? There's just not a lot of light there. So if we know the light attenuation to unknown depth and the depth limit, then we can begin to determine minimal light requirements. So to determine the light requirements, again, we have to assume that SAV grow to the depth of the light at the depth at which they grow to the deepest is the minimum amount of light they require. And then from that, we can calculate any minimum light required for them to survive at any particular depth. There's two main ways that SAV ecologists have done this over time. They've calculated percent light to the leaf, which requires a lot of inputs. So you have to know things like the light attenuation we talked about. You also have to know how much dissolved organic nitrogen's in the water, things that would block the light before it gets to the plants themselves. And then anything that's growing on the surface of the plant, so epiphytes, we need to know what that is in addition. So you can imagine that's a lot of data you have to get and a lot of time and effort to monitor that. So a lot of monitoring programs don't use percent light to the leaf. That's primarily used for research purposes. Majority of monitoring programs use percent light to the water. And the reason is because you only really need to know maximum depth that your plants, you want them to survive, and light attenuation at that depth. And so if you have light attenuation and the maximum depth, you can determine what percent that SAV actually need to survive at any depth. This is not a new concept. Dr. Dennison's paper that you guys were given from 1993 is a seminal piece of work that really first illustrated how much light is required for SAV found globally. So this is a table from that paper in 93. And that last column shows you the minimum light requirement. And you can see this is for a wide variety of species. Since then, scientists, we don't always trust each other, right? So since then, people have tried to measure this over and over and over again. And these numbers are pretty stable. They're pretty robust measurements. So for example, the species that are highlighted in yellow are a couple of our high salinity species, Halidoli redii or shoalgrass, and then Zostramina or eelgrass. And so these numbers about minimum light requirements for our species in North Carolina and the other ones highlighted in the table really haven't changed that much in the many decades since then, since we've actually been monitoring this percent light requirement. So one of the reasons that we're so focused on clarity when it comes to SAV, they are found in the water column. There's lots of other things that could potentially impact them, changes in salinity, dissolved oxygen, for example. But when you look at how much light SAV actually need to survive, it's really high compared to other plants and even other marine plants. So in general, SAV require about 4 to 29% of the surface light to actually survive. And then if you compare that to terrestrial plants, they only need 0.5 to 2%. So seagrasses, even at their lowest light level, is twice that of a terrestrial plant. And the majority of plants, including those and most of our estuarine systems, require closer to 20%. Putting that even in context for other organisms that live in high salinity areas, like your algal areas, your marine algae is about 0.5 to 1%, and even phytoplankton is 0.5 to 1. So in comparison to our terrestrial plants and other marine plants, SAV really require a lot of light. They have a very high minimum light requirement, and so their survival really depends on good water clarity. If you have good water clarity, they are much more likely to be able to withstand any other kind of disturbance. And so this link that was first sort of put forward about this high light requirement and the ability of SAV to kind of be a good sentinel species was first highlighted in that Dennison paper. They used this link to establish SAV as a sentinel species for water quality changes. Their reasons for this were that the SAV do respond to all the chemical parameters that other sentinel species respond to, like your oysters, the pH, dissolved oxygen, all that as well. But they're plants, so they need light. So in addition to those chemical parameters, they also respond to changes in water clarity, and in particular changes to nutrients. Another benefit for using SAV as an indicator of water quality is that they're not harvested, right? So they're not out there, they're not fished or anything else. And so if you see a change in SAV, like an increase in area or a decrease in area, or any kind of extent that you're measuring, that can be primarily directly linked to changes in environmental conditions only, and not to any other measure, any other management activity. So this first came out in '93, and since then they've implemented this kind of idea of using SAV as an indicator for water quality in the Chesapeake Bay and many other systems. And they revised it and looked at it again in 2017, and they determined that SAV are still really good sentinel species for water clarity, and that using SAV, they've actually been able to track changes in water quality in Chesapeake Bay with the increase or decrease in SAV species. The way that they actually implemented this was they took in the Chesapeake Bay region in 2000, when they first kind of put a big effort in using water clarity as a standard and as a response of SAV to water clarity as a standard for water quality. They took Chesapeake Bay and divided it into 4 salinity zones, but you can really divide it just into 2. Your low salinity, which is the tidal fresh oligohaline region, and then the high salinity, so the mesohaline or polyhaline. They determined both percent light to the leaf and percent light to the water. They did this based off of hundreds of different studies and in situ measurements throughout the Chesapeake Bay and other regions for the same species that were found in the Chesapeake Bay. And they determined that the percent light through the water that your low salinity species needed was about 13%, and your high salinity species was about 22%. So this first came out in 2000. They implemented these water quality standards and water clarity standards. And then in 2003, the EPA actually put it into a rule for this region, so a water clarity standard. They made it a little fancier, where they had second depth measurements to specific depths. But as you can see circled here, they kept the same water clarity measurements. They kept the 13% for the low salinity and the 22% for the high salinity. And this is because this was a pretty consistent and robust measurement of water clarity for those species who survive in those regions. But I don't often like to use Chesapeake Bay as an example. They have a lot of money and they have a lot of resources. And so it's not always the best to kind of use that as well, if they can do it there, we can do it here. So I put together a list of other management areas where they've actually used percent light at depth for SAV as a standard as part of their water quality rules. And so you can see Tampa Bay actually beat the Chesapeake into implementing this as a rule in '96. And then even the European Union in their Water Framework Directive actually used a clarity standard of percent light at depth for SAV as part of their water quality rules and regulations. EPA put it together for Chesapeake Bay officially in 2003, and then revised it and kept those numbers in 2007. Indian River Lagoon in Florida, Charlotte Harbor, and even internationally in Gladstone Harbor, which is an active port on the Great Barrier Reef. And there's a lot of dredging in that area, and they purposely looked at percent light to the at depth for an SAB standard in those areas. Here in North Carolina, we were lucky enough to have the CHIP put out a very strong recommendation in RA 4.7 that said to actually adopt the standard for light penetration for SAB regions based on that low and high salinity breakdown. So low salinity would be 13% to the deep edge, which they define in the CHIP as 1.5 meters, and high salinity at 22% to the deep edge at 1.7. Based on a lot of the information that went into that, and again, the robustness and the really good repeatability of these measurements, in July and September, the SAC, for the Nutrient Criteria Development Plan, supported the adoption of both the low and high salinity standards. That's all I have. Any questions?
Thank you. Do you have any questions for her? Well, I'll start off. You said SAB were proven to be a good water quality indicator, but they're also an important food source, correct?
Correct.
Want to elaborate more on that?
Sure, yeah. So SAB have a lot of different roles in our coastal ecosystem. So they're an important habitat, an essential habitat for our commercial and recreational fishery species. They are a direct food source for some of our marine herbivores, like your sea turtles, and even as waters are warming, even more fish. We're actually finding more fish are eating the seagrass directly. They're really important. They actually improve local water quality conditions, so they help increase clarity, they reduce sediments, they reduce nutrients, and then they also store a lot of carbon. So they take carbon out of the water column and they bury it below ground in their roots and rhizomes. So there's a lot of functions that they do, and so keeping them around is a really good way to keep those functions happening. It's also a lot cheaper to protect them than it is to actually restore them.
You have experience in the Chesapeake Bay, is that correct?
Yeah, so I did my master's and PhD in the Chesapeake Bay region at William & Mary, and so I was working on these water clarity standards as part of my graduate degree work from 2003 to 2009. So yeah, I'm pretty good. I'm still in the water quality subgroup for the Chesapeake Bay program today.
Is there any observations you'd like to make about what worked and what didn't work in the Chesapeake Bay Restoration Plan from a state perspective? Because the states had to implement it state by state in some fashion, right?
Yes, they did. And so I think what worked really well was actually going out and monitoring the grass and having that information. So, and having that direct measurement of changes in SAV by segment. And so I think the SAV water bodies that are part of the CHIP were a great way to do that. So that was really helpful. I think one of the problems when it came to restoration of SAB in the Chesapeake Bay is they set their goals really high. So they based them off of what was actually happening in the 1930s and 50s as far as cover of SAB in the Chesapeake Bay. And there's many more people in that system now. It's definitely not going to ever be the way it was in the 30s. And so trying to set the standards and that restoration goal too high as sort of a double-edged sword. It gave the folks a really good goal to work towards, which was nice, but when you don't meet that goal, there's a little bit of backlash for that as well. So that was sort of the biggest negative takeaway I found in the Bay program. Yes.
So have you looked at any of the
Could you pull your microphone closer?
areas in North Carolina to see what some of our problem areas are and how this can be applied to local issues?
Yeah. So I get an opportunity to work with the Albemarle-Pamlico National Estuary Partnership, and so they do a lot of monitoring. They've done the entire Albemarle-Pamlico Sound. They did 2007, 13, and then they did smaller segments starting in 2020. And what we found is that overall SAB in North Carolina is declining at about a rate of about 5% of total area per year. Now that's not the same everywhere. So there are some problems areas, for example, back in Bogue Sound, that rate of loss is closer to 10%. And so there are definitely areas where we can actually see these changes in SAB, and we have some good monitoring data. DMF and DEQ have some really great long-term data sets. It would be great if we could get more of these data sets in the shallow areas where the grasses actually are. Sometimes it's hard to use channel data to say what's actually happening in the shallows. But we can see overall, especially back in Bogue Sound, it's a sort of a mix of a decrease in water clarity and then rise in temperatures, right? And we can't necessarily do as much about managing temperatures, but we can manage the water clarity.
And are these Chesapeake Bay findings applicable, or do you have to go back and do an assessment based on Pamlico Sound or that area where it becomes specific to the qualities of the water?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of those numbers actually came from outside the Chesapeake Bay, and they applied that in the Chesapeake Bay. So, for example, the Haladuli number that closer to the higher 22% came from Dr. Kenworthy in North Carolina. So those numbers are actually from all over the place. And one of the great things is that we found, well, there may be a little bit of a difference. It's not enough to really change how you would manage that particular water quality standard or aspect of it.
And my last question, is there anything that is comparable in freshwater that would cause problems with submerged aquatic vegetation, or are we looking at that at all?
So we do have the low salinity standard, that the 17%.
So that would be freshwater, not just, okay.
Yeah, so that's well, this is the primarily thing we're looking at right now, I think, is for my SAC would be the estuarine conditions, but those same freshwater species that are encompassed in that are included tidal freshwater. So they would also be freshwater species in that 17%.
Yes, Vice Chair Harris.
And I'm just thinking in my brain, how does this all function with changing salinities? I mean, and that may be just another impact factor, but depending on the year, we could see jellyfish and salt with the wind pushes up on the Pamlico, and other times it's perfectly fresh. So, and it's brackish and it's going back and forth. So how does that impact the vegetation?
Yeah, so one of the great things that DMF and AFNF have done, if they've actually divided, and the CHIP does a great job of this as well, is looking at the resource, and they've broken it down by species, so low and high salinity. And so the water bodies, while there may be some areas in between where you could see that change, if you manage for like the species level, then you actually wouldn't have as big of an issue with that 17 and 22% as part of it. But that's something that I know the SAC is going to be talking about in couple of weeks about how to do that in particular and actually get more specific details on that. But right now the resource is kind of divided broadly in that low and high, and then we're going to try to figure out how we can make that transition zone a little bit clearer.
Yes, Chair Smith.
So just to follow up on that, so you were talking about the fact that the Scientific Advisory Committee will be meeting again in a couple of weeks. Can you describe a little bit more what the remaining issues are for the committee to discuss related to the SAB standard?
Yeah, so we have the magnitude. I think everybody's pretty solid behind that. But now we're talking a little bit more about the duration and then the frequency of it. So what would be the time to actually implement this? Is it growing season? Those are some of the things. And we've had lots of discussions on that already. And I feel like we're pretty close in the next couple of, if not the next meeting, to kind of move forward on picking out those final details. And I don't know, you're going to give an update on that? And they're going to give an update on that after me.
Commissioner Bailey, is there anything you'd like to say? Any observations based on your CHIP background?
Well, I don't think I can add anything other than I also live in New Hanover County. I'm glad you're living in our county. I know from the CHIP that, you know, the main emphasis has been on the Albemarle Pamlico Sound, but, you know, we'll also I'm interested in whatever's going on in the lower Cape Fear, because there's some impacts there that I've seen through this whole CHIP process. So can you talk a little bit about what's going on there? And do you have students going out doing monitoring? Just sort of curious about what your students are doing.
Yeah, so, well, one of my students actually won an award at the Coastal Conference yesterday, so a little shout out for Lindsay. But she won a best poster presentation. Most of our work is actually on the intercoastal waterway, so there's not a ton of SAB. There's a lot of marsh grass, but not submerged plants in the Cape Fear and the lower Cape Fear. But we are monitoring seagrass as far south as Topsail. So there's a lot of work, and we've paired up with Ann Deaton and some of the DMF monitoring they've done with the aerial survey to provide some ground truthing data for that. We've also established some, what we call SAB sentinel sites, where we get from, I guess, March, or actually April to September and November, we go out monthly and we get measurements of seagrass or SAB presence absence and the resource, how they're doing, get some drone imagery to see how that changes over time. And then we pair that with water quality measurements. So we've actually established a shallow water quality station where we're getting direct measurements of light and then chlorophyll and turbidity as well. So, and my students are out all the time. They're out on Monday, actually, if the storm doesn't come through.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Speaking of students, Dr. Jarvis took time to rearrange her schedule so she could be here today. We really appreciate that.
No, no,
Thank
no
you.
problem. My students are thankful to have a day off of lab, so.
If you could, are you able to stay for the remainder of the meeting in
Yeah.
case questions come up?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
That would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just to give a bit more background for our new members, we are talking about standard setting at this stage, and I'm sure the Division of Water Quality, Division of Water Resources can describe it much better than I, but setting a standard is the first step, and then following that, the division proceeds with drafting rules to bring to the commission on the implementation of those standards. Did I describe that okay?
Great.
Okay, good. So what will happen is that we will first be presented with a draft rule that will include the standard. And then after the commission makes its decision about that, if it decides to proceed, then from that point forward, there will be a stakeholder process, extensive stakeholder process, and the development of implementation standards for applying that standard, implementation rules for applying that standard. We just went through that part of that process for High Rock Lake, the standard setting for High Rock Lake this past year. So now we would like to hear from Karen Higgins, who is the chief of the planning branch or planning section, Division of Water Resources. She is going to give us an update on the schedule and process for that, as well as on some other subjects that are also the responsibility of this committee. So welcome.
Hello.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the NCDP EPA level part of the program and how it relates to North Carolina too.
Yep, I've got the slide.
Great.
All right, good afternoon. Karen Higgins, Division of Water Resources. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things to talk with you all about today. Kind of broken them into sections, so I'll pause for questions as we move along. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is NCDP and kind of expand a little bit on what Dr. Jarvis just updated you on regarding the clarity standard. So just to kind of step back a little bit, the NCDP, the Nutrient Criteria Development Plan, is a plan for developing nutrient criteria for surface waters in North Carolina. And we do that by linking the criteria to the designated uses of the water body. So we have a number of designated uses in North Carolina. Examples: fishable, swimmable, boatable. We have classifications for trout to support our trout in the western part of the state, as well as primary nursery areas and water supplies. So this plan is required in part of a MOA that we have with EPA. The plan was first developed in 2014 and updated in 2019. And anytime we update the plan, that has to be reviewed and approved by EPA. So the way that North Carolina approached it was to have site-specific standards in 3 different types of water bodies. So looking at lakes and reservoirs, looking at estuaries, and then looking at rivers and streams. We set it up such that we have a pilot water body for each of the different water body types, and those are listed here. As was mentioned, the first one we tackled was High Rock Lake, and the EMC approved a site-specific standard for High Rock Lake earlier this year. Right now, the Scientific Advisory Committee is focused on Albemarle Sound and the Chowan River, and in particular with SAB. So as we heard, clarity is very important for submerged aquatic vegetation. And so the SAC has been working with the division over the last year and a half or so, looking at different components of the clarity standard. So as was mentioned, the division and the CHIP plan and the SAC are all on board with a magnitude value that is protective for SAB habitat. The SAC has also sort of determined the duration, so that's when does this standard apply? And then there are some other pieces that are still under discussion, including frequency. So magnitude, duration, and frequency are all part of the standard. So what should the value be? How long should it be there? And then how often can you exceed that and still protect existing uses? There are a number of other things to consider with this standard, including spatial extent. While the focus has been Albemarle Sound, the direction and guidance from the SAC is to expand the standard through all coastal waters. And so that's something that we're working through with the SAC as far as how to capture that in the standards. Also, as was mentioned, looking at the historical extent of SAB, how far back do we go? How do we determine where SAB beds are and where the standard would apply? We're also working with marine fisheries on the monitoring plan. They're going to be the primary collectors of this data for us. So we're working with them and their staff to see what their existing protocols are and how we can incorporate this. As the SAC hopefully wraps up with their recommendation on the clarity standard, we will be reaching out to them to see whether there are other nutrient-related criteria that we need to consider for the Albemarle and the Chowan. So with that, any questions on NCDP?
So spatial extent is also involving defining the extent of the salinity, high salinity versus low salinity. Is that correct? Or is it really just more coverage for the standard overall, the coast?
It's both. It's both. So the way the SAC has, the recommendation has a different value for high and low. So we do need to be clear about when high applies, where low applies, and then just across the coastal waters, where the standard applies, so we know where to sample for the standard.
And what thoughts is EPA expressing about this? Do they have to sign off on this?
Yes, so EPA does have a member on the Scientific Advisory Council, so it's really helpful to get their input through the process. Once the rule package is before the EMC, will go through its full process. And then just like with any standard, we have to submit it to EPA for their approval. So their involvement on the SAC does not guarantee their approval. We still have to, dot all of our I's and cross all of our T's, provide all the justification to support the standard, but ultimately they will need to approve it at the very end of the process.
I remember EPA played a large role in the High Rock Lake decisions too. So Commissioner Bailey can offer any thoughts she wants at this point, but I think because this was a goal in the most recent CHIP update for some expression of commitment in 2022, I think it's appropriate at this point for the chair to seek a consensus from the membership about proceeding. We're not taking an action. I'm not calling for a vote, but what I'd like to do is just go on record that we are instructing the Division of Water Resources to continue development of a proposed SAB standard based on the completed work of the Science Advisory Committee, which is expected in the November-December timeframe, and input from the CIC, that stands for Criteria Implementation Committee, is that right?
Yes.
And with the goal of bringing a draft rule to the Water Quality Committee for consideration, hopefully in the first quarter of 23. That's as late as the end of March. That's the goal. So I would like to see the consensus of the membership for that. Do I see nods or just thumbs up or any reservations about that? I'm seeing all positive signs that we are there on this consensus, so I'd like to have that included in the meeting minutes. So, any other questions about this topic? Thank you. If they come up during the meeting, we might bounce back, but right now, feel free to move on.
Okay. All right, so next up we have E. coli. So just a little background. So the EPA 2012 recreational water quality criteria for bacterial indicators recommends that states set a bacteriological water quality standard for primary recreation freshwaters using either E. coli or Enterococcus. We currently have a standard of fecal coliform in freshwaters across the state. As part of the 2020-2022 surface water triennial review, we propose to adopt the E. coli as a site-specific standard in the Asheville Regional Office for 19 counties in our Class B waters. We received over 1,400 comments on that proposal during the triennial review. And while the general consensus was support of switching from fecal to E. coli, there was broad interest in applying that statewide to all Class B waters. So in consideration of the many public comments received, the EMC did not adopt the site-specific standard as proposed. DEQ committed to proposing a statewide E. coli standard for primary recreation waters and to conduct a study that will allow DEQ to evaluate the financial impacts of switching to an E. coli standard for all Class B freshwaters, as well as the scientific implications to existing TMDLs that address current fecal coliform impairments. The division updated the EMC on the work plan in May. And since that time, we have started the study. We have 47 ambient stations on Class B waters across the state. Due to limitations for sort of holding time from when a sample is collected to when the analysis needs to begin, 24 sites met the criteria for inclusion in our study. We are sampling during the swim season, which runs from April through October. So this year we started, a few of our stations started in August, and the full sampling happened in September and October of this year. We will start again in April of next year and continue on to have a full sampling season. Each site will be sampled 5 times during each month for a total of 840 samples. So this diagram was shown to you all in May, just kind of, again, details the study. We finished stage 1. We developed the scope of the study and contracted. We did not contract with universities, but contracted with some certified labs within the state to collect and run the samples. We are in stage 2, which is the midst of the bacteria study. When that's completed, we'll do QA/QC and evaluate the data, and then we'll proceed on to rulemaking with a Class B standard. Any questions on E. coli?
I'll ask about the map of the 24 sites. Did you bounce back to there?
Sure.
So I see that you have 2 in southeastern coastal plain. And what led to those versus something in the central or northeastern part of the coast?
Yeah, so we do have some ambient stations in the northeast part of the state. The challenge is that those are collected from a boat. So when you have the samples from the boat to where the nearest certified lab was, it would exceed the holding time. And so all of the data would have an asterisk because it wouldn't meet the protocol. So we really didn't want to invest our limited resources in collecting data that wouldn't meet the criteria of the lab.
That's just a very practical elimination criterion, huh? Vice Chair Harris, since you're from the northeastern part of the state, do you have any thoughts about this? Do you, you think that there's any concern that something might be missed up there, or?
I mean, we're always going to have those kind of concerns, but I look at it like I do turbidity and holding.
Would you
times.
speak in?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm kind of rambling anyway. So, yeah, I think we always have concerns about that. I didn't know the reasoning, so that makes sense. But it kind of equates in my mind to like turbidity standards. It's just the holding time and the practicality of moving it through. But I mean, we've got a lot of sites here. We're a step closer. So that's all I can really add to that, not being a scientist. But yeah, it would be nice to have some of those samples pulled from that direction as well.
And so it seems like the denser areas of sampling points are in the mountains where this whole conversation began, and for recreational concerns as well as other concerns. And then right in the Piedmont, almost on the I-85 corridor, almost. Okay, just thinking about this map. So the next set of collections will be in spring, is that right? What month is that again?
That's right. We'll start in April and go through August. For most of the sites, 9 of the sites will end in July.
And then was your last slide the calendar? So I think I made a comment about this the last time we discussed it. I'm hoping that the QA process can not be slighted, but still be done maybe at a better pace than an extended number of months. But if there's a good quality assurance project plan in place for that, it should go pretty smoothly, I hope. So how does this calendar compare to the triennial review calendar? We were trying to accelerate this some because of the concern, but.
Yeah, so I'd looked at this. Now I can't remember. I think it's similar, really. I think will be before the commission, end of 2023, early 2024 with the next triennial review likely. So this is about the same time frame.
Okay, all right. Any other questions or comments about this topic? Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right. So, though I said I was done with E. coli, I was mostly just done with the E. coli study. In addition to that, I do want to highlight some other things going on within DWR in the western part of the state regarding E. coli. And I told Landon I would give him a shout out for all the great work him and his staff are doing out there. They have a Western North Carolina water quality monitoring program. And as you can see, there are 3 components to that program. One of those is a collaborative sampling strategy. So the regional office is working with a number of different organizations and developing additional partnerships to have folks collect samples that are then run by the Asheville regional office in their lab. And then those results are posted through Swim Guide and with that same organization. In addition to that, they had worked with USGS and Mountain True to develop an estimator for E. coli. So it's just a basic regression model where you can sample turbidity and predict E. coli to give more real-time current predictions for folks tubing on the French Broad River. So if you get a E. coli reading from a week ago, that doesn't really tell you what the water's like when you're out there on the tube that day. So this model helps them have more real-time data. And then the Asheville Regional Office is also setting up a PCR lab. They're building it this winter with hopes of shortening the E. coli analysis time and tracking the human marker. And just to talk a little bit more about the E. coli model, so this is just a screenshot from a website, and I apologize that it looks so dark. But this, again, it provides real-time data using a USGS sampling station. The website was launched in August, and it provides data during the swim season. So if you go right now, it'll tell you to come back in April. But the website is there, and you can, welcome to take a look at that. All right, so I'm going to move on to silver. So just to provide a little bit of background, the chronic silver standard was adopted by the EMC in 1989 to address discharge of silver from industrial and municipal facilities. The standard was implemented as an action level for MPDS dischargers. In 2016, metal standards were revised and EPA disapproved the use of action levels. EPA stated that wet testing done alone is not suitable to protect uses because a discharge can pass wet testing while still contributing to an excursion of the standard in stream. So the Federal Clean Water Act requires states to adopt standards to protect designated uses such as aquatic life. And aquatic life standards are designed to protect for various toxicity effects. Acute standards protect organisms from short-term exposures that may result in mortality, while chronic standards protect organisms from long-term exposure that may impact growth, reproduction, and behavior. The EPA criteria for silver demonstrates acute toxicity effects to aquatic life. 8 of the 10 species studied are found in North Carolina's surface waters. And the North Carolina Chronic Silver Standard was developed using the narrative standard for toxic substances that's found in 15A and CAC 02B 0208. In October 2021, DWR received a petition for rulemaking to remove the freshwater chronic aquatic life standard for silver. In March, the EMC denied the petition. They did direct DWR to evaluate the need for the chronic silver standard and to explore the levels that the standard could be set at, including the process for how the levels are calculated. DWR conducted a literature review. We did not find nor were we provided with any studies supporting the removal of a chronic silver standard, nor were we able to find enough representative taxa based on published research to calculate a new value. Therefore, our conclusion is to proceed with conducting toxicity studies to support a potential new standard. This could be a hardness-dependent base standard or a static value. We have been discussing the requirements with EPA to talk about what kind of taxa, what hardness levels and other parameters that EPA would want us to include in a toxicity study. We're also identifying potential funding sources and partners to complete the work. And we've been working with different stakeholders to make sure this is a collaborative process as we move forward. And with that, any questions on silver?
Is there a report or a memo on the lit review findings?
There is not.
Can there be?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we need that on the record since we committed to do it, to demonstrate, the extent of literature, the periods reviewed, and basically the sources that were used for the search and criteria for arriving at the decision. I think that would be helpful to document that. With the toxicity studies, I don't know that we saw that as the next step, but I appreciate your volunteering that that would be something that would be beneficial. and looking at a new approach to setting the standard. Wish you the best of luck with the funding side of it. And thank you for keeping us updated about that. And I think Mr. Bentalora was the person who did the literature review. Is that right?
He was part of it, but other staff as well.
Well, our thanks to the staff for their work on that, because I know this was above and beyond what was originally planned. So thank you.
All right. Gotten through 3, 2 left, and then you all are done with listening to me. So next, I'm going to talk about a couple of our nutrient management strategies. So first, I'm going to talk about Jordan Lake. So Jordan Lake was created in 1983 for flood control and water supply. Pretty much as soon as the dam was built, the lake started having water quality issues, and you all actually classified it as nutrient sensitive this same year. The Jordan Lake rules are designed to protect and improve the water quality of the lake. As with all nutrient management strategy rule development, it takes several years and lots of stakeholder meetings, and those were adopted by the commission in 2009. Some of those rules were amended by 2 session laws also in 2009. 2011 to 2016, there were a number of session laws passed to modify and delay parts of the management strategy. There's a list on the slide showing those in effect and those that are delayed. In 2016, the General Assembly established the NC Policy Collaboratory and directed them to begin a 3-year study on Jordan Lake. The collaboratory submitted their final findings in December of 2019. As sort of about a year before their final report, the collaboratory added a component to have a lake model. And so when they provided the final report, we needed to build on the model a little bit to use it for regulatory purposes. So we've been working with Dr. Bowen to get the model finished development, calibration, running the different scenarios, and getting peer review process. So we have been contracting him to finish that work. We anticipate fall of next year to have that model completed. And then we will proceed into stakeholder engagement and rule text development to complete the rule readoption for that management strategy with the timeline 2025, 2026 for formal rulemaking. Any questions on Jordan Lake?
Chair
Well, no,
Smith.
clarifying question. Don't look at me like that.
Yes.
So in terms of the lake model, essentially, if I'm understanding you correctly, the report from the collaboratory included a lake model that was not sufficient to be the basis for the entire rule set or nutrient strategy. Is that correct?
Yes, there just wasn't enough time to get it all the way through the process. So they began the development and provided that in the study, but it didn't go all the way through a process a model normally would for us to use it.
And can you remind me what the commission's timelines are? Because I know originally the legislation had timelines for both the collaboratory's work and the EMC's work on implementing rules. So can you just remind me what those timelines are?
Yeah, so it required that the collaboratory complete by 2019, and then it just said that rulemaking will commence after that, and it didn't give you all an end date, which has been helpful because we've had some contracting challenges with the model, but you all don't have a deadline at this time. So.
I will say after going on 12 to 13 years, not having a timeline is a mixed blessing. But that's where we are. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I believe it was maybe 2 years ago. I sort of lost time with COVID, but I think it was a couple of years ago that 2023 was going to be the target for rulemaking. So this appears to have slipped 2 to 3 years.
Yep. We lost almost a year and a half from contracting. And then just some of the modeling work has taken a little longer than we anticipated. And then we've had our own staff vacancies. So the staff person in charge of Jordan Lake, that position's vacant right now. So.
Now, I thought I understood it last week or so from someone that one of the stakeholder committees has resumed work, or there's a new committee created. Are you familiar with any of that?
Well, so it could be, I guess, one of two things. It could be High Rock Lake, which I'll talk about in a second. The other thing is sort of as this has been going on, there has been a group called Jordan Lake One Water, or JLO, that DEQ is a part of, but is not in charge of. It's really more of a grassroots effort to get folks to think more locally. So if you're in Greensboro, you don't maybe care about Jordan Lake, but you might care about the watershed that you're living in. So really trying to get folks to think more locally, work collaboratively, think a little differently. So Jordan Lake One Water has been going on for quite some time. I think they did recently. Something did come out, but I can't remember if it was, I can't remember, so I'm just not gonna say.
That's okay. But I think there's been some recent activity.
There has.
So,
They were established as, I think, an organization or something official that I just can't remember right now. Their work did win an award at the National One Water Conference in September, so that was really exciting to see their work recognized.
the modeling that's being done by UNC Charlotte, right? Is it looking at sediment in any way? Because I remember when the NC State modeling results came out, they were making some observations about the role of sediment. And I continue to think that sediment is an issue that needs to be considered stronger in a variety of rulemaking settings across the state. So can you
Yes,
talk about that?
Well,
bit.
just in that it's part of it, but beyond that, I'm really not the best to
Okay.
provide any details.
That's fine. Thank you. I'm just glad, it's reassuring to know that they are looking at the role of sediment. Thing. Any other questions or, yes, Chair Smith?
Just one more, just because of the passage of time, given the collaboratories report and then the time lag with COVID. My memory of their final report was that it was very consistent. Their findings were very consistent with the original findings from the Division of Water Quality at the time and the EMC in adopting the original nutrients strategy. Is that fair to say, or did you see anything in the report that would stand out as being significantly different from the assumptions on which the original nutrient strategy was based?
No, I think that's a fair assessment. I think what we have found from our discussion so far with Dr. Bowen is that the reductions may even need to be more than what was in the original strategy. So that's sort of what we're still kind of working through with the different scenarios of what those values need to be.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, so High Rock. So you all heard most of this in May, so I'm going to mostly skip over skip over it. But as I mentioned at the beginning, talking about the NCDP plan, High Rock Lake was the first water body, pilot water body. And based on the FAC recommendation, we did move forward with the site-specific standard for chlorophyll A. That went through rulemaking, and the EMC adopted that in July of 2022. So we have kind of moved on to the next phase. High Rock Lake has been impaired since 2004. And so based on the revised chlorophyll A standard, we're moving forward with nutrient management strategy development. We're doing that as a facilitated stakeholder process. So we have contracted with a facilitator to help us hold these meetings. It's an interesting process. So I went to the sort of the kickoff meeting in September. We had over 80 people attend. We had 2 sessions, one in the afternoon and one in the evening. We had over 80 people, which is great. They were from all different groups and stakeholder. Anyway, it was a well-attended and well-rounded group. The way we're proceeding is kind of outlined here in the big giant purple blob. We have a steering committee, and their first meeting is actually next week. And they are going to be drafting nutrient management strategy goals, and they're going to guide and oversee the technical advisory groups. We have established 4 technical advisory groups focused on agriculture, wastewater, stormwater, and riparian buffers. And the idea is that these different groups are going to focus on things and work together and go back and forth with their findings as they move forward. They're going to be working with the Division of Water Resources throughout the process. And the idea is that eventually we will have text drafted for rules and have a rulemaking package before you all to go through the process. So the hope is to begin formal rulemaking in 2024 with EMC adoption in 2025. Any questions on High Rock? Yes, ma'am.
Do you already have those technical advisory groups set up and filled, those positions filled?
I know the steering committee has been set up because their first meeting is next week. I think the technical advisory groups, I'm not sure if those are fully established. But I can certainly find out and let you know.
Thank you.
Will EPA play as prominent a role in this process as it did in the standard setting? Does it have a role?
No, they won't really be involved the way they were in the standard development. We're sort of approaching this as a TMDL alternative. So as long as it meets sort of the criteria for EPA ultimately of a TMDL alternative, that would really kind of be their only involvement, but it's not like a standard development. They give the states a lot more flexibility for that process.
Help me remember, is this your last slide? Questions, okay. I guess just one observation. I mean, High Rock was first, and then we been doing Falls or being doing Jordan and such. All of these activities are clearly taking over a decade to see to completion. Do you expect, this is probably not your question, but I'll put it out there anyway. Do you expect that with time, because we've drawn the learning curve now on how to do these, that they could be more efficient and processed at a faster pace in the future for any other needed standards or rules? And lessons learned, will we be able to take home lessons learned, I guess, and how to improve in the future?
I mean, I guess, sure, we'll be faster and more efficient. I think we are getting to the Albemarle standard more quickly than we did in High Rock Lake. So Brian's not here anymore. That was his goal when he was leading up NCDP, was he wanted to be faster than High Rock Lake, and I think we are. But these are new and complex standards, so there isn't really a rule book that we can follow necessarily. But I think we have found just being thoughtful about how we move forward and getting different stakeholders in the scientific community engaged and on board with the pieces as we put them together is helpful.
I'm glad you said that, because in some ways, I would hope that there would be more opportunities for research funding other than just the state to pursue some of these topics, because they're valuable research topics. And if the university community or other research organizations could be more proactive and help with the effort, it might make things move faster too, because these seem to depend a lot on the state providing the funding for the research. But they're fascinating research topics, I think. So, any other questions or comments? Yes.
If I might,
Great.
Madam Chair. Karen, thank you for this
Yes.
overview.
So thank you.
Karen has gone through a slate of things that are, as you mentioned, complex, and they do take time. In addition to that, Karen's working with about a 40% vacancy rate in her intersection as well. So these challenges are all complex and time consuming, tend to make it even more difficult. And I appreciate the interest in SAB criteria, clarity criteria going forward. We will do our best to meet the standards for spring, but just to let you know, staff is working diligently. And Karen and I have had these conversations many times, and we appreciate the work of the staff. I do want to recognize one position Karen has gotten filled is her classification as standards person, which is critically important. And Paul Wojciechowski is entering into that new role. So welcome, Paul. Unfortunately, Paul's leaving as the supervisor of our 401 program, which causes other issues with us other places. But I know Karen's excited to have him on board and hoping to get her staff filled out as quickly as possible. There are opportunities are coming forward, but just want to thank staff for your efforts and the work that y'all do on all of these things that have been brought to you. I know E. coli and silver are additional workload too, so we appreciate it so much.
Yes, thank you very much. We really appreciate everybody's work and the summary today. It's been a while since we visited some of these topics, and it's I think helpful for all of us to hear where things stand. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And while you all had to listen to me, most of this information came from all my wonderful staff. So thank you to all of them for all their help on this. Thank you.
And congratulations, Mr. Wojciechowski. You're a friend and visitor of the EMC before, so we look forward to seeing you again with a different hat on. So, thank you. Okay, our final topic on the agenda is remarks from our council to update us on coastal joint update on the coastal joint and inland waters designated by the Marine Fisheries Commission and Wildlife Resources Commission. Council Phillips has been following this carefully, and then after his remarks, Chair Smith, who has also been tracking this, will give us her perspective on it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to give you all an update sort of what is being considered by the Marine Fisheries Commission. As many of you know, I represented that commission before taking the position I hold now and joining this commission, which is why I always smile when I see you all, because I can tell you that other commissions are much harder, much more difficult. I say that with tongue fully in cheek, but, and I find myself temporarily back in a position of not only advising this commission and two others, but I'm also back with the Marine Fisheries Commission for the upcoming meeting. As some of you may be aware, there is a major difference between inland waters and coastal waters. Many of your rules depend on those boundaries. Many of the applications of the statutes that you're responsible for depend on those boundaries, including the interbasin transfers, which we heard about this morning. There is a special provision for what's considered coastal waters versus inland waters. And there are also joint waters. Now, joint waters are, by statutory definition, coastal waters in which a significant number of inland fish are found. And those boundaries are set by agreement by the Marine Fisheries Commission and the Wildlife Resources Commission, and then by joint agreement, and then codified by administrative rule. As many of you may recall, when what we commonly refer to as HB 74, House Bill 74, came into existence, that's a rule review and readoption process. The Department of Environmental Quality and its associated commissions had to go first for a lot of these things, and you were asked to designate your rules into one of three buckets: either necessary with substantive public interest, and if it received that designation, then you had to readopt the rule as if it were a new rule, go through the process again. Necessary without substantive public interest, meaning that you would not have to go through the readoption process, but you got to keep the rule. And then unnecessary. Well, when I was still counsel to the MFC, as my primary responsibility, the MFC reviewed its rules and designated its the current joint boundaries or joint water boundaries as necessary without substantive public interest, because there wasn't a great deal of attention paid to those in terms of needing to change the lines one way or the other. And so those rules were remained in effect without the need to readopt them. Subsequently, the Wildlife Resources Commission had to go through the same process. They're sort of at the tail end of all the commissions that had to do these things. And they have designated those, or previously designated those rules as necessary with substantive public interest, so they're having to readopt them. Based on that status or that designation, conversations took place between the chairs of the two commissions, being the chair of the Wildlife Resources Commission and the chair of the Marine Fisheries Commission, and discussion was had specifically about adopting new boundary lines, which included the removal of joint waters, but also where those boundaries were going to be developed between, or where they're going to be designated between what's inland and what's coastal. And of course, that has an impact to this commission as well as the Coastal Resources Commission. Within the last month, the chair of the Marine Fisheries Commission asked to meet with the chair of this commission, Chair Smith, as well as the chair of the Coastal Resources Commission, Chair Cahoon, to discuss this proposal that had been developed through the two chairs, Chair Bizzle and Chair Crump of the WRC. And Chair Bizzle wanted to hear what concerns or what issues the other commissions have. And through that discussion, he received a lot of understanding received a lot of information about what concerns and how it would impact these two commissions as well, and the regulations that they're charged with carrying out. The Marine Fisheries Commission is going to be considering this proposal at its meeting next week. And in discussions with the chair after that meeting, we wanted to make you all aware of the proposal And you can see on the attachment, and Shelton was kind enough to pull it up on screen, this is the current designation of lines. If I can figure out how to manipulate it again, all of the red or stripe, those are the current joint waters. And what's important about joint waters is that both rules, or both commissions' rules applied, you know, jointly in those waters. So this is what they look like now. And I'm sorry, the red, I said this wrong. Sorry, the red is coastal waters, and the blue is joint waters. And so rather than trying to go through the different legends and the different layers of the maps, I'd invite you to explore that on attachment A to the agenda today. I am not suggesting or recommending that you take any action on that, but we wanted to make you all aware of it. And I know that Chair Smith will express, but there was great concern about how the designation or the removal of joint waters and the changing of the boundary lines between inland and coastal waters would impact, for relevant to you all, how you handle water quality issues, among many, many other things. As I said, the Marine Fisheries Commission had already adopted in rule or had in place in its rules the current boundaries. And so if there was a decision to change those boundaries, it would have to go through the rulemaking process. And of course, this commission would have the opportunity to comment on those should the Marine Fisheries Commission decide to move forward with them. But that is the status of where we're at now. And if I may, Madam Chair, be glad to turn it over to Chair Smith and let her speak a little bit more about the meeting.
Thanks. And just to maybe simplify the issues for this commission and for the Coastal Resources Commission, the Wildlife Resources Commission, the Marine Fisheries Commission are basically talking to each other about who regulates which waters for purpose of fishing. And so the Wildlife Resources Commission has jurisdiction over all inland waters. The Marine Fisheries Commission has jurisdiction over coastal waters. Their conversation is about fish and how to regulate fishing and fisheries between inland and coastal waters. The problem is that dividing line, and we'll set aside joint waters for a moment. Joint waters are coastal waters. The line that's important is the line between coastal waters and inland waters. Joint waters are just coastal waters where Wildlife Resources Commission has some overlapping regulatory authority. But if you just think about it in terms of coastal versus inland waters, that becomes really significant to both the coastal program and to this commission because numerous state statutes reference that dividing line as the definition of estuarine waters. And so if you look, it's particularly clear for the Coastal Resources Commission statutes, and it's carried forward in their rules, where the definition in state law, not just in regulations, but in state law of estuarine waters is that those are waters that are seaward of the dividing line between coastal and inland waters. So the issue is if some decision is made, it has to be jointly between Marine Fisheries Commission and the Wildlife Resources Commission. If a decision is made to move that boundary line further inland, which is what's under discussion, that would mean some areas that are currently considered estuarine waters and estuarine shoreline areas under the coastal program in particular would fall out of those categories. They would no longer by state law be considered estuarine waters. They would no longer be considered estuarine shoreline for purposes of the coastal management rules. And I think one of the questions for this commission is what the impact is on our water quality rules, and particularly those that deal with estuaries, how we do monitoring. It's less clear. There are some statutory references for this commission, that refer to coastal waters as it's defined between the other two commissions. But I think we probably need to take a closer look for this commission's purposes at the other ways that a change might affect water quality rules that are less obvious on the surface than they are with the coastal management regulations, where it's very, very clear. One crossover issue that we talked about with the Marine Fisheries Commission chair, who was gracious enough to meet with both me and Chair Renee Cahoon from the Coastal Commission, was stormwater rules, because right now, this commission largely regulates stormwater outside the jurisdiction of the Coastal Area Management Act. But in the coastal counties where CAMA has jurisdiction, there are a separate set of coastal stormwater rules. And those rules are very much tied to the designation of estuarine waters and estuarine shoreline, which means, again, if the dividing line changes between coastal and inland waters, that changes the universe of those coastal stormwater rules. And that's not the intent of the discussion between Marine Fisheries and the Wildlife Resources Commission. They're worried about fish. But the fact is, if they resolve the fisheries issue by changing the boundary between coastal and inland waters, it potentially has significant impacts on water quality and coastal development rules. And so one thing we want to do is just make sure this commission's aware that the issue's percolating, and perhaps do a closer look in the near future at what some of the impacts on water quality rules in particular would be. No action has been taken yet. As Mr. Reynolds said, the Marine Fisheries Commission meets next week. They're going to be discussing the possible resolution of their issue with the Wildlife Resources Commission. So we don't know how that is going to go. But we wanted to at least make this commission aware of that discussion and perhaps the need to spend a little bit more time understanding what the implications would be and how we might need to respond if some action is taken. Now, that would require rulemaking. So whatever happens next week is not going to be the end of the story. They would have to actually amend existing rules to make the change. So that would be, as you know, a lengthy process. And there'd be an opportunity to weigh in on that. So this is just making you aware of the issue, and that we may need to do a little more work on this depending on what happens with the Marine Fisheries Commission meeting next week and their ongoing negotiations with the Wildlife Resources Commission.
Madam Chair, if I may, I'd like to add to that, that I also said very little at the last meeting. As Chair Smith was able to address all the issues without the need for me to say much at all, which is my favorite way to attend a meeting. So,
Thank you.
but I will keep everyone informed as we're moving forward through this process.
Thank you both for that information. Can I ask on the map, could you, when you talk about the blue labeled waters, could you be clear what, point out an example of blue? We've
Okay,
got
so-
the ocean blue and we got a darker
Right.
blue. And
Sorry, it should have been a little bit more clear. And but if you look at the Dairy County bombing range,
yes, that's a darker blue.
that is a darker blue, and then that would be, I think that is an example of, let me get back to it.
Is that
That
a
is the joint waters,
that's a
right?
joint
That is the
water.
joint waters.
So,
And then Lake Mattamuskeet, further down to Hodge County, that is obviously, that's an inland water. Which that's a freshwater lake, as are the other sort of blue with a pinstripe.
That doesn't make sense.
anything in the southeastern part of the state? Any joint waters?
You have to,
Enlarge that.
yeah, I think especially when you go up the Cape Fear and also the news, as you zoom in, you'll see, and like I said, you can yeah, New Bern's a lot of joint waters, but if you go down southeast,
There's-
to go back down.
Okay.
Yeah,
See, that's much clearer now to
Right.
see the coverage.
yeah, and a lot of those, the reason those joint waters were designated that way is because of the presence of a lot of the species and resources that are considered marine and estuarine resources, either through the MFC's designation of that species as an estuarine resource, through the development of a fisheries management plan, or because there's a lot of species that are highly migratory and are regulated through the federal partners through the interjurisdictional FMP process, such as the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Council Commission, the Mid-Atlantic Council, and the South Atlantic Council.
If you would, Sheldon, just keep that one enlarged for so we can discuss an example about movement. So if the two bodies decided to agree on something to take to rulemaking. So, for example, in the New Bern area, that larger portion. So which way would the blue move left? The boundary line for the blue would move left? Or
So, and very likely, there's a lot of different layers to the map, so you have to go in and click the different ones to try to pull them up. That's why I mentioned the attachment A. If you look at the different legends, and I even have a very hard time. Fortunately, Laura Kablansky with EMF was able to operate this map, and you don't necessarily want me to do that. I'm not exactly a troglodyte, but if I were, or a Luddite, that'd be a very good one.
That's a basic question. Can you have a joint fishing waters outside of a Cameron County?
Yes, absolutely.
Have a joint outside of a Cameron County?
If you follow the Neuse River up, it does get higher. I mean, a Cameron County, I assume you mean the coastal counties, like the 20 counties that are on the.
Beaufort County, it goes from Cameron County to a non-Cameron County.
Mhm.
Can you have joint waters up in Pitt County? I guess.
Yes, absolutely.
It goes that far, but I was just curious.
Chair Smith?
Yes.
Kind of confusing, even for people that fish, where the freshwater and the coastal waters meet. So
Well, yeah, and so those joint waters, and again, the rules of each commission apply, and that's really to focus on the activity, but also which species of fish you're going to find in that area. And then, I mean, fisheries world is very complex because there's joint enforcement agreements, there's management areas. I dare not speak the name striped bass anywhere. A lot of issues. Sorry.
Chair Smith?
So to use this example, so the areas in light blue with the lines, those are all coastal fishing waters. The dark blue, those are also coastal fishing waters currently, but there's joint jurisdiction. So they're called joint waters because both wildlife and marine fisheries has regulatory authority within those waters. But all of the blue, the light blue and the dark blue that you're seeing right now are coastal waters. As I understand the proposal that's under discussion now, it would essentially be to eliminate joint waters, which effectively means what you're looking at in dark blue right now would cease to be coastal waters and become inland waters. And so that's what is now showing you, by state law, everything in blue you're looking at right there would be considered estuarine waters. And if that dividing line moves so that what's now dark blue becomes inland waters, what you're seeing in dark blue would cease to be designated as estuarine waters.
But the actual boundaries themselves would also move between inland and coastal as well.
Yes, this is significant implications for the coastal resources and the Environmental Management Commission rules. So I agree. Commissioner Monis, you look like you were going to ask something earlier.
It was just answered. I just needed an
Okay,
example.
Thank you. Any other questions about this? So this is just our first introduction to this topic. I think we have a lot more to learn and to analyze about the impacts of any decision between those two bodies. Chair Smith, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, we just wanted to make the EMC aware this issue is out there. And I think after the Marine Fisheries Commission next week, we may have a better idea of what direction things are moving in and whether we need to ask our staff or Mr. Reynolds to do a little bit more investigation of exactly how a change would affect water quality standards and implementation.
So is there any process in place to uh, facilitate discussion among the three or four commissions when changes like this occur that could affect another commission outside of the two that are agreeing on it? Is it facilitated at some level in government when there are conflicting authorities?
Not necessarily formally. There is a provision in state law that if there's a disagreement between the Marine Fisheries Commission and the Wildlife Resources Commission over where the boundary should be between coastal waters and inland waters, that is the conflict to be resolved by the governor. Outside of that, when we have issues like this where there may be multiple other commissions with an interest in the outcome, there's not a formal process, but as I mentioned, Chair Bizzle from the Marine Fisheries Commission was very kind to set up a meeting with myself, Chair Cahoon, their staffs, to talk about what some of our sort of red flags were. And obviously at that stage, we weren't speaking for our commissions. It was more an exchange of information about how there may be implications for these other programs. So it's going on informally. If there is actually a rulemaking process, then we could conceivably, comment on draft rules and participate in that. I don't know of any other formal process.
Thank you. And we do appreciate the Marine Fisheries Commission Chair keeping us informed about that. So thank you. And thank you for representing the commission at that meeting. Any other comments or questions about this? Well, we're eager to hear more as it develops, as the story develops. So thank you. I realized at the beginning of the meeting, we did not consider our meeting minutes from September. So I'm going to bring those up at the moment and ask if there are any comments on meeting minutes, any revisions or additions to those minutes. If there are none, may I have a motion to approve the meeting minutes of September?
Madam Chair, I move approval.
Thank you, Mr. McAdams. Do I have a second?
Second motion.
Thank you, Ms. Harris. Okay. Any other comments about the meeting minutes? If none, may I have a voice vote for approve? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. The meeting minutes are approved. Okay, given that we are in the final stages here, I do not have any revisions to committee interests at this time. The table of topics of interest to us. I'll ask our director if he has any comments closing the meeting.
I have none.
Thank you. Again, we continue to thank the division and all of the staff for their efforts, especially given the situation with low employment numbers. Staff numbers make it very hard on you, and we certainly understand that, and thank you for all your efforts to keep us moving. So with that, we will close the meeting. Our next meeting will be at the regular date and time for January. And a good holiday to everyone. Holidays, plural. It's adjourned.
Let's start this.